The ballroom shimmered under soft amber lights, the river outside, gliding in silence. Jazz floated through the air like a memory that refused to fade. I adjusted the cuff of my plain white shirt, the one I'd bought on clearance for $20, and tried not to notice my stepfather's smirk from across the table. Charles Grant never missed a moment to remind me I didn't belong. At least, look like you belong, Lila, he said loud enough for the next table to hear. A few guests turned laughter tucked behind their champagne flutes. My mother pretended to be busy with her napkin. I smiled, a quiet reflex I'd perfected over years of family betrayal, disguised as small talk. "It's clean and paid for," I said softly. "That's enough for me." Honey Aunt Marge leaned toward me, her pearls trembling as she whispered, "Is that 20 before or after coupons?" I kept my tone calm, the same one I used with difficult clients. "Stacked coupons, ma'am." A few chuckles surfaced around us. Charles didn't laugh. He simply lifted his glass and muttered, "Figures." I turned toward the river, focusing on the reflection of light instead of the sting in my chest. Toxic family moments had a way of finding their rhythm, and I'd learned to dance quietly to survive them. The wedding was flawless, at least that's what everyone kept saying. White roses lined the tables, the smell of money thick in the air. Every toast felt rehearsed, every smile polished for photographs. The irony didn't escape me. I had spent years working behind the scenes of weddings like this, fixing last-minute disasters, covering missed payments, making sure everything looked perfect, no matter how chaotic the story beneath. Maybe that's why I noticed the sound before anyone else did, the faint electronic beep from the POS system at the bar. It came again. Beep. Then a murmur. I glanced over and caught the manager's eyes. He looked uneasy, holding a small receipt that refused to print. My pulse quickened, but I said nothing. I knew that look. It was the same one I'd seen when a card declined during a corporate event, when a client's limitless card suddenly had limits. I watched as the manager whispered to the waiter, who hesitated, nodding nervously. Charles was still mid-story, explaining to the bride's father how Grant Home Interiors had once furnished half the homes in Mount Pleasant. His voice was smug, practiced a man in love with his own success story. The manager moved closer. I noticed his glance flicker to the clipboard tucked under his arm, where a document peeked out just enough for me to read the first two words, "Venue Contract," and below that, faint but visible, my own signature. L. Monroe. A twinge of electricity rushed through me. He knew, or at least he had just realized. Magnolia Events wasn't just coordinating this wedding, it owned the contract. My company. My signature. The irony made me want to laugh, but I didn't. I stayed silent, waiting for the next chord in this family drama to strike. The waiter approached our table, his voice uncertain but polite. "Excuse me, sir," he said, eyes darting to Charles. "There seems to be an issue with your payment." Charles looked up confused. "What issue? Your card didn't go through," the waiter said. The words seemed to echo. Conversations froze mid-sentence. A few guests glanced over, whispering. Charles frowned, pulling another card from his wallet. "Run it again." The waiter took it, nodded, and walked back toward the counter. My mother stared at her hands. Aunt Marge blinked. I felt the room shift, the air thick with awkward tension. I almost pitied him. Almost. A moment later, the waiter returned, his face pale. "I'm sorry, sir," he said quietly. "This one declined, too." The silence that followed was heavier than any music. Charles's hand tightened around his napkin. His face flushed deep red. The groom tried to change the subject, but it was too late. Everyone had seen, everyone had heard. The manager stepped in, calm and composed. "It's all right," he said, turning slightly toward me. "Ms. Monroe already settled it this morning." A soft gasp rippled through the room. Charles turned to me, disbelief freezing him in place. I met his eyes and offered a faint, controlled smile. "It's clean and paid," I repeated. His mouth opened, but no sound came. My mother covered her face. Aunt Marge whispered, "Lord, that's karma." I rose from my chair, smoothed my shirt, and glanced once more at the reflection of the chandeliers on the polished floor. It wasn't the bill that stopped him. It was the realization of who had already paid it. I was 15 when silence became the safest language in our house. My father had passed away 2 years earlier, leaving behind a few savings, an old piano, and a college fund he had opened under my name when I was 8. $12,800. He had written that number on a note tucked inside a folder, his handwriting small and deliberate. I found it once after his funeral and promised I would protect it. 2 years later, my mother remarried. Charles Grant came with shiny cufflinks and the kind of charm that made people lower their guard. He owned a small chain of home decor stores and liked to call himself a self-made man. During the wedding toast, he said, "In this family, money will never divide us." Everyone clapped. I should have known what that really meant. By the fall of 2012, he had convinced my mother to simplify our finances. He used words like transparency, partnership, and growth. He suggested we combine everything my college fund included into a single family investment account. He promised it would grow faster that way. My mother agreed, her eyes soft with trust. I signed the transfer form with shaking hands. The next morning, my access to the account disappeared. When I asked about it, Charles smiled the way people do when they think they are teaching you something. "Budgeting builds character, Lila. Budget is love." Then he left for work in a new SUV that smelled like leather and entitlement. I stared at the driveway for a long time, the way people stare at the scene of a small crime. Something had been stolen, but you could not call the police for it. Family betrayal does not leave fingerprints. Months passed, and I learned to measure time through receipts. He started tracking what I spent on notebooks, calling it good practice for adulthood. At first I tried to argue, but my mother said gently, "He just wants to help you grow." I swallowed my words. Each one tasted like chalk. On weekends, Charles lectured about the value of saving. He loved spreadsheets more than conversations. At dinner, he'd talk about opportunity costs while slicing steak. Once he said, "You don't need to go to college right away. Real life is a better education." I remember my mother smiling nervously. I nodded, pretending to listen, while my eyes drifted to his new watch, glinting under the light. Later that night, I sat at my desk and looked up the term family trust. It sounded noble, like something built on love and logic. In our house, it meant control. By 2013, the investment he promised had turned into a black hole of excuses. When I asked where the $12,800 went, he said, "Markets fluctuate. Be patient." I wasn't angry, yet only confused. Then one afternoon, while sorting mail, I noticed an envelope from a fine dining restaurant in Mount Pleasant, a receipt for $620. The date matched the same week he had told me the stock market had taken a dip. That was when doubt became data. I didn't confront him. Not yet. I knew he liked to win arguments through tone, not truth. So I did something different. I started writing emails, polite, concise, documented. "Hi, Charles. I'd like to request an updated statement on the college investment account just to learn how it's performing. Could you please copy the family accountant on your response?" "Thank you, Lila." I sent it from my school laptop, CC'd the accountant, and waited. 2 days later, he replied, short and irritated, "Focus on your studies. The account is fine." The accountant replied a few minutes after that, "Charles, please forward the quarterly statement as requested." I smiled for the first time in weeks. That email thread became the first quiet revenge I ever earned, a digital trail, proof that politeness could be a weapon sharper than anger. After that, I began saving every receipt, every transfer notice, every unexplained purchase. Revenge did not need noise. It only needed evidence. Around that time, my friends talked about colleges, dorms, futures that seemed light and easy. I didn't join the conversation. My plans were heavier. At night, I worked part-time at a cafe near Broad Street, folding napkins and serving customers who tipped with warm smiles. Sometimes I'd see couples arguing over bills, and I'd think about how money was the most polite way people learned to hurt each other. One evening, a woman forgot her card and said softly, "It's embarrassing, isn't it?" I told her. Not really. Everyone's card declines someday. It's what happens next that defines you. I didn't realize until much later that I was describing my stepfather's future. In the summer of 2014, Charles announced that he had diversified the investment. When I asked what that meant, he said it means I moved it into better hands. I didn't ask whose. My mother, meanwhile, grew quieter, as if guilt had taken the shape of silence. The house became heavy with unspoken things. We still had dinners, but they were careful dinner smiles that cracked too soon, laughter that ended too early. I learned to leave early under the excuse of homework. The night before my 18th birthday, I checked my email. There was an automated notice from the accountant. Account closure confirmed. I stared at the screen until the letters blurred. $12,800 gone. That night, I opened a new document and titled it Red Ledger. First entry, debt of dignity unpaid. In it, I wrote everything I remembered. Dates, conversations, purchases, the smell of that new SUV. It wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about reclaiming the language of fairness. Years later, that same habit would become my armor in business, but at 15, it was just survival. Before going to bed, I walked into the kitchen for water. Charles was sitting at the counter reading a glossy furniture catalog. He looked up and said, "College is overrated, you know." I said nothing. He smiled. "You'll thank me one day." I looked at the catalog and then at the receipt poking out of it, Mount Pleasant Steakhouse. The same place another bill dated the same week he had said we couldn't afford textbooks. I remember the exact thought that crossed my mind. Not anger, not even hate. Just this one day, I'll send him an invoice. By 2016, I had learned that leaving home was not always about distance, but about silence measured in rent payments. I found a small studio above a bakery in downtown Charleston, $950 a month, the first space that was mine alone. The walls smelled faintly of yeast and sea salt, and when the delivery truck passed each morning, the window rattled like an old friend clearing its throat. I paid the first month's rent with savings from cafe shifts and a few side gigs planning small birthday parties. It was not much, but it felt like ownership. For the first time, every receipt in the red ledger was in my handwriting. My mother cried when I moved out. Charles did not. He just said, "Real life is expensive, Lila," as if that was news to me. The job at Magnolia Bay Resort came through a friend who remembered my patience with details. They needed an assistant for the events department, someone who could handle client calls, bookings, and endless spreadsheets. My first day was a storm of checklists and floral arrangements. The woman in charge, Marion Blake, was in her late 40s, sharp but kind, with the kind of authority that came from surviving other people's chaos. She wore neutral colors and carried a leather-bound planner that looked older than me. "You're a note-taker," I can tell she said, after watching me scribble during the orientation. "Keep that habit." The best defense in this business is documentation. That was the first lesson in what she called the ledger mindset. Every deposit, every retainer, every delay record at timestamp at keep proof. She said trust was important, but paper was sacred. Verbal promises vanish faster than wedding cake, she liked to say. During my second week, I made my first mistake. A nervous bride wanted to secure a date, and I drafted her contract while holding a cup of coffee. My hands shook when she handed over the deposit, and I spilled a thin stream of coffee right across the printed page. I froze horrified. Marion looked at the mess and then laughed softly. "If coffee doesn't touch a contract, it's probably not real business," she said. The bride laughed too, and I exhaled. Later that night, I blotted the stain and filed the contract anyway. It still smelled faintly of espresso months later, like a reminder that perfection was less important than evidence. I stayed late most evenings learning the rhythm of the resort, the sound of the ballroom doors closing, the hum of the printer when invoices rolled out. It felt honest even when clients were not. Money had weight here, but it was measurable, not manipulative. Marion became more than a boss. She became a mentor. She saw the way I double-checked every number and said one afternoon, "You've got a quiet spine, Lila." That's rarer than you think. One of my first real tests came with a client everyone called the rich kid bride. She had booked a mid-tier package but expected top-tier treatment. A few days before the final meeting, she announced she could not pay the $1 $200 deposit until Daddy moves some funds. Marion raised an eyebrow, then told me to handle it. I drafted a polite email reminding her of the payment deadline and copied the accounts department. No threats, no attitude, just policy. She did not respond. 2 weeks later, I updated our contract template to include a late fee 3% per week on any unpaid balance. Marion read the draft and nodded. Policy applies to everyone, she said. I filed it under version 2. A month later, the same bride called in panic. She needed to book the resort's prime date in April, the one every Charleston wedding fought for. I checked the calendar, paused just long enough for her to hear the decision coming. I'm sorry, I said the policy applies to everyone. Silence, then a sigh on the line. Can't you make an exception? I could, I said gently. But then it would not be a policy. She hung up without saying goodbye. 2 hours later, another client booked the date, paying in full within minutes. Karma, I realized, does not always arrive as drama. Sometimes it comes as a simple line in an updated contract. That night, I walked home along the harbor, the air thick with salt and possibility. I thought about the $12,800 my stepfather had called an investment and how it had vanished into nothing. Maybe this was how I would rebuild it, one signature, one clause at a time. In the following years, I grew into my role. Marion trusted me with more responsibility, and together we transformed the department into a well-oiled machine. I learned to speak the language of contracts fluently. Deposits were promises. Retainers were boundaries. Refunds were lessons. Every number told a story of conflict and justice, sometimes of kindness too. Clients came and went, but the ledger stayed loyal. It did not lie. It did not flatter. It did not forget. Marion used to say, "Paperwork is how you stay fair when feelings try to take the wheel." She was right. By 2020, I had saved enough to upgrade my studio furniture secondhand but sturdy. My nights were quiet except for the clicking of my laptop and the hum of the city outside. I still spoke with my mother sometimes, but our calls were shorter. Whenever she mentioned Charles, I changed the subject. Silence had become my inheritance. In early 2021, Marion invited me for coffee at a cafe overlooking the Ashley River. She placed a folder on the table neatly labeled Magnolia Events Proposal. "I'm starting something new," she said. "Partnership-based. I want someone young, sharp, and disciplined with money. Someone who knows the value of a timestamp." I smiled but hesitated. The word partnership felt too close to the memory of what Charles had said years ago about family investment. Marion noticed the pause. "You've built yourself from receipts and proof, Lila. This isn't blind trust, it's earned." She slid the folder toward me. Inside were projected budgets, profit splits, and her signature already on the last page. "Think about it," she said. "It's time your red ledger paid dividends." After she left, I sat there staring at the river, sunlight flickering like loose coins on the surface. For the first time in years, I felt a kind of hope that didn't scare me. Yet a small voice inside still whispered caution. I folded the folder shut and wrote one note in my ledger that night. Consider partnership carefully. Not all investors wear suits. By 2023, I had stopped measuring success in numbers and started measuring it in silence. The kind of silence that followed competence, the kind that filled a room when people finally realized you were the one holding it together. Magnolia Events had grown beyond my imagination. Marion and I ran 5 major venues across Charleston, including one I had dreamed of since my first day at the resort. The Riverside Hotel Ballroom, a place where chandeliers hung like memories, and the river glimmered beyond glass doors. What I never imagined was that my first full-circle event there would belong to my stepbrother, Ethan Grant. When my mother called about it, her voice was small, hopeful. "They want to save some money, Lila. Maybe you could coordinate. It would mean a lot to your stepfather." I almost laughed, but I didn't. The old reflex to protect her still lingered. "Of course," I said, though my tone was neutral. Send me the details." 2 days later, Charles called directly. "We'll need a discount," he said. "Family rate." His tone had not changed in a decade, still that smooth arrogance of a man who believed proximity was payment. I pulled up the standard contract template. "We don't do discounts, but I'll make sure you get our most efficient package," I said. "I'll need to review every dollar he added. I don't like surprises." "Perfect," I replied. "Neither do I." The contract I sent was identical to every other client's. Deposit $9,000. Milestone to $14,500, due 30 days before the event. Balance $23,600, due 5 days before. Late fee 4% per week. Cancellation policy deposit non-refundable. I attached it with the subject line, "Standard Terms Magnolia Events," and copied the accounting department. 10 minutes later, Charles replied with an attachment of his own. My contract printed and scanned with handwritten notes in the margins. Questions about every clause, every number, every small line. At the bottom, he had written, "Back in my day, we didn't need so many rules." I smiled when Marion saw it. She leaned over my screen and said, "Back in his day, venues were barns." Her dry humor broke my restraint, and I laughed for the first time that week. It was not mockery. It was the sound of balance returning. After 2 weeks of back and forth, Charles finally signed. His signature looked the same as it had on those old family checks, slanted and self-assured. I added my initials next to the clause that read, "Late fees apply automatically upon missed milestones." There was nothing personal about it, but it would soon become very personal. Planning the wedding was a test in patience. Ethan was polite enough, but Charles hovered over every invoice as if waiting to find a flaw. He questioned the cost of linens, of lighting, even of flower transport. Every call began with, "We just want to be practical," and ended with, "You're overcharging." I responded with calm professionalism. All costs are transparent. I would say sending him PDFs of vendor quotes and signed confirmations. By mid-spring, everything was on schedule, except for one thing: milestone payment 2. It was due April 10th. On April 15th, the system sent its first reminder. On April 22nd, a second email went out automatically, this time with a line in bold, "Late fee applied 4% per week." That was when my phone rang. "This is ridiculous," Charles barked. "I was going to pay next week. The system doesn't know that I said evenly. It's automated. Remove the fee." "I can't. It applies to everyone." "You think you're running a bank?" "No," I said softly, "just a business." There was a pause long enough for me to hear the low hum of his frustration through the receiver. "You've forgotten where you come from," he said finally. I smiled to myself. "On the contrary," I said, "I remember exactly." The payment arrived the next morning, penalty included. I didn't need the money as much as I needed the principal. Every dollar was a lesson returned with interest. Marion raised her coffee cup when I told her. Justice, she said, is rarely loud, but it does collect. The weeks that followed were a blur of final fittings, floral approvals, and menu tastings. The Riverside Ballroom gleamed under its glass ceiling, the river catching the evening light just right. I supervised every detail personally. Charles didn't know that Magnolia Events was one of the venue's operating partners, nor that my 30% ownership gave me authority over its bookings. To him, I was still the help. That amused me. Sometimes justice hides in plain sight, waiting for the right invoice to surface. During the final walkthrough, Charles arrived with his usual clipboard and questions. "Why are these chairs more expensive than the catalog?" he asked, tapping his pen. "Because these ones don't wobble," I said. He frowned, not sure if it was a joke. It was. At the rehearsal dinner, my mother thanked me quietly. "You've made everything beautiful, Lila." Her words were genuine, her eyes tired. I wanted to tell her that beauty was easier to manage than family, but I just said, "That's my job." Ethan's fiancée, Anna, was gracious but distant. She called me Miss Monroe as if to draw a polite border. I didn't mind. Some boundaries protect both sides. The only time I lost composure was when I overheard Charles boasting to one of the guests that the venue had given him a great deal. I wanted to correct him to say the venue had not given him anything, it was his daughter by marriage who had earned it. But I stayed quiet. There was more satisfaction in knowing the truth privately than enforcing it publicly. The day the final balance was due, the payment arrived right on time. I looked at the confirmation email and exhaled. The transaction number glowed like punctuation on a long chapter of unfinished history. In the memo line, Charles had typed, "Final payment family event." For once he was right. It was a family event, but not in the way he imagined. That evening, I stayed late at the office with Marion reviewing contracts for the next quarter. She asked, "How does it feel doing business with ghosts from your past?" I thought about it before answering. "Like collecting debts I never sent." "Good," she said. "Keep the receipts." Pride has a balance sheet, too. She turned off the lamp and left, leaving me in the soft glow of the monitor. On the screen, the event summary blinked with all the right words. Paid in full. No disputes. I scrolled to the top where my signature sat next to the venue's letterhead. L. Monroe Partner Magnolia Events. There was no anger left in me that night, only clarity. Some revenge stories do not need fire. They just need an invoice that clears. The weeks leading up to the wedding felt like living inside an invoice that never stopped printing. Every detail came with a $sign, and every $sign came with a memory. I knew the Riverside Hotel ballroom inside out by then, the way sunlight hit the windows at 4 p.m., how the chandeliers needed polishing every third day to keep the river reflections clean, how guests always underestimated the number of napkins. Preparation was math disguised as beauty. I kept the cost sheet pinned on my wallflowers, 6,800 lighting, 4,200 live band, 3,600 wedding cake, 1,450 event insurance, 900. The list was longer, but those numbers were my heartbeat for the month. Every payment confirmed was another line of quiet control. Ethan's fiancée, Anna, was kind but indecisive, a dangerous combination in event planning. She changed the flower palette 3 times, finally settling on blush and ivory. That choice would have been harmless if not for Maddie, one of the bridesmaids who accidentally ordered fuchsia ribbons instead of ivory for all the bouquets. The delivery arrived the morning before the ceremony. I opened the box and froze. It looked like someone had melted bubble gum on silk. Marion would have laughed, but I was alone. I grabbed my emergency bouquet kit, a small box I kept for moments, exactly like this, filled with ribbons, pins, tape, and a tiny pair of scissors that had survived more disasters than I could count. By noon, I had stripped and rewrapped 12 bouquets with soft gold ribbons scavenged from last year's event stock. Maddie walked in, pale and apologetic. "Leela, I think I might have ruined the wedding." I smiled. "Only if you tell anyone." She gasped. "I won't." I winked. "Good." Then it never happened. It was my favorite kind of humor, the kind built from composure. By the time Charles arrived for his inspection tour that afternoon, the ballroom gleamed. The scent of white roses mixed with citrus polish filled the air. He walked in with a clipboard, his reading glasses perched halfway down his nose, like a judge about to announce a sentence. "These numbers," he said, pointing at the invoice, "they seem high for just lights." "They're not just lights," I said. "They're atmosphere. Back in my day, atmosphere didn't cost $4,000. I smiled. "Back in your day, people got married in barns." He didn't laugh. I didn't expect him to. He had that way of speaking that turned every comment into a challenge. And this live band, he continued, 3,600. That's outrageous. They're a licensed union group. You're paying for professionalism. They can play a few extra songs for that, right? Not without a separate clause and payment. The contract specifies 3 hours. "Oh, come on, that's ridiculous." "Not really," I said. "It's respect for labor." He snorted, muttered something about modern nonsense, and left to find the caterer to complain about salad portions. I watched him go, a small smile tugging at the edge of my control. There was something satisfying about knowing that his signature was already binding. Every word he objected to had been approved by his own pen. The next few days were a parade of small chaos. The band leader called to confirm the playlist, the florist wanted final color codes, and the bakery needed to know if the cake topper should include the couple's initials. Anna insisted on E and A in gold. Charles tried to argue that silver was more timeless, but she stood firm. I respected that. Even in wealthy families, asserting taste was an act of rebellion. The night before the wedding, I stayed at the ballroom until nearly midnight, walking through each station with my clipboard. The linens shimmered, the lights dimmed to a soft champagne hue, and the cake sat under a glass dome like an artifact. I wrote small notes for the staff check: candle levels, hourly refresh, ice buckets, test microphones. Precision had become my piece. Early the next morning, as the first delivery trucks arrived, I stood on the terrace watching the fog roll off the river. The air smelled like beginnings and tension. Marion texted, "How's the circus?" I replied, "All lions accounted for." She sent back an emoji of a flame. By 10 a.m., everything was in motion: hair, makeup, last-minute steamings. Maddie tripped on her heels twice, laughing nervously, and I silently prayed she wouldn't faint mid-aisle. The catering team tested the serving line twice, and the band tuned up in the corner. At noon, Charles showed up in a navy suit and that old superiority that never aged. "Lila," he said, adjusting his cufflinks, "make sure the band stays longer tonight. Family deserves a little extra. They'll stay as long as the contract allows," I said. "You can always request an extension with written approval and additional payment." He waved his hand dismissively. "I'll handle it with them directly." "All right," I said, though. My tone carried a quiet warning he did not catch. The ceremony went beautifully. The sun broke through at the perfect moment. Guests dabbed their eyes, and Anna looked radiant in her ivory gown that almost matched the corrected bouquets. For a few hours, even I forgot that this was a revenge story disguised as a wedding. When the reception began, the band filled the hall with soft jazz guests, danced, laughter echoed, and even Charles seemed content, at least until the clock struck 9. That was when he approached the bandstand, smiling like a man about to pull a favor. "Play another half hour," he said. "We're not done celebrating." The band leader, a patient man named Reggie, checked his watch. "We'd love to, sir, but our contract ends at 9 sharp. I'm the father of the groom," Charles said. "Just play. No one will mind." Reggie hesitated, then gestured toward the clipboard on his stand. "I'm sorry, Mr. Grant, but your signature is right here under the time clause. Any extension requires payment and management approval." The guests nearby began to notice the exchange. The laughter faded into a ripple of awkward silence. "This is absurd," Charles said, his voice louder now. "You can't just stop." Sir Reggie said calmly, "We honor contracts. You agreed to this schedule." Charles's face flushed, his hand tightening around the edge of the stage. For a moment I thought he might yell. Instead, he looked across the room and met my eyes. I didn't move, didn't smile. I simply held his gaze. After a long beat, he turned back to Reggie and muttered, "Fine. End it." The band nodded and packed up on the dot. Guests murmured, confused but polite. I could almost hear the collective realization spreading through the room. Rules were rules even for men who thought they wrote them. As the music faded, I approached Reggie and handed him a tip envelope. "Thank you for sticking to the policy," I said. He smiled. "Most folks break under pressure." "You didn't." "Pressure is temporary," I said. "Documentation lasts forever." That night, after the guests left and the staff cleared the last of the dishes, I sat alone under the dim lights of the ballroom. The silence felt earned. My phone buzzed a message from Marion. "How'd it go?" I typed back, "Perfect." The band played the truth. The morning of the wedding began with humidity, thick enough to press against your lungs. Charleston, in June, never pretends to be graceful. The river shimmered in the distance like a mirror that knew too much. I arrived at the Riverside Ballroom at 6:30 with a thermos of black coffee and a clipboard heavier than a confession. The florist was already there, trimming stems and muttering about humidity wilting the hydrangeas. The bakery truck pulled up late one tire, hissing the driver apologizing between yawns. "Long night," he said. "That makes two of us," I replied. By 8, the ballroom smelled like vanilla roses and nerves. The bridesmaids fluttered through the halls in satin robes that rustled like gossip. Maddie, the one with the bouquet incident, had mascara on her hand and panic in her eyes. "Lila," she whispered the punch, just spilled, on the main table. I walked into the dining area and saw a red stain spreading across the white cloth like a crime scene. The children froze their little hands, still clutching the half-empty cup. "It's fine," I said. "We'll fix it." I sprinkled salt first, then poured club soda from the service cart, blotting gently with napkins until the stain began to fade. The mothers watching sighed in relief. One of them said, "You've done this before." I smiled. Weddings or stains? They laughed and the tension melted. By 10, the chaos turned into choreography. The officiant rehearsed his lines, the photographer tested the lighting, and the band tuned instruments one by one. I moved through the room like a quiet current, adjusting small things no one would ever notice, but would somehow feel: angles of candles, symmetry of chairs, even the scent of the citrus diffusers near the entryway. That's what good coordination was: invisible control. Around 11:30, a crisis announced itself in the form of the groom's voice echoing from the dressing room. I forgot the rings. The words froze everyone. The photographer gasped. Anna turned pale, and Ethan looked like a man who'd just seen his future dissolve. I stepped in calm as habit. "It's all right," I said. "I have something." I reached into my bag and pulled out 2 silver bands. They're props, I explained, used for rehearsal shoots, same size as standard. They'll do until we get the real ones. Ethan stared, speechless. "You carry fake wedding rings among other miracles," I said. The officiant grinned. "That's professionalism." The ceremony went on without a hitch. When Ethan slipped the stand-in ring onto Anna's hand, no one in the audience could tell. It glimmered like it belonged there. The guests clapped, the music swelled, and I allowed myself a rare moment to breathe. For 2 hours, everything was smooth until Charles decided to speak. The reception was in full swing. The guests laughed, glasses clinked, children danced between tables. I stood near the bar scanning for anything that might fall apart. That was when I heard his voice across the microphone. "I just want to say," Charles began, "how proud I am of my son. And of course of my wife for organizing everything. She has such grace under pressure." The applause that followed was polite thin. My mother smiled nervously. Then he added, "And Lila. Dear, you've done a fine job too. I see you're still shopping clearance, but somehow making it work." The laughter that followed wasn't cruel, just collective discomfort, the kind that comes when people sense they shouldn't laugh but can't stop themselves. I felt dozens of eyes turned toward me. My first instinct was to disappear, but years of practice had taught me that silence could be a weapon, sharper than words. I walked toward the microphone slowly, my heels tapping against the floor like a countdown. "Thank you, Charles," I said, my voice steady. "It's clean and paid. Some bills matter more." A hush settled over the room. The DJ, unsure whether to cut the music, froze mid-button. My mother looked down. Charles cleared his throat, the confidence in his grin cracking just slightly. "Of course," he said, chuckling awkwardly. "Just a joke." "Of course," I replied, smiling politely. "They usually are." I stepped back, and the DJ finally restarted the music. The moment passed, but not before it etched itself into every whisper that followed. Guests would retell it later, the story growing like moss, the stepdaughter who answered with grace sharper than any insult. Still, I wasn't angry. I was tired. The kind of tired that comes from cleaning up the emotional messes of people who never thank you for it. Around 4 p.m, the catering team reset for dinner. The band eased into soft jazz, and the bartender began mixing signature cocktails. I double-checked the bar's tab settings, standard pre-authorization as always. But a few minutes later, the POS terminal beeped twice. Then again. The manager, a tall man with patient eyes, walked over to me holding the small screen. "Ms. Monroe," he said quietly, the card for the open bar just hit its limit. I blinked. "Whose card, Mr. Grant's?" He looked uneasy. The system tried twice for another pre-auth, but it declined. "Should we switch to guest pay mode?" "Not yet," I said. "Give it 5 minutes." He nodded and stepped back. Across the room, Charles was holding court near the dance floor, his laughter booming louder than the music. He had no idea. Or maybe he did, and denial was just another skill he'd perfected. The manager hovered by the bar, waiting. I could feel the story tightening like a thread ready to snap. I checked my watch. The main dinner service would start in 10 minutes. If the bar charge didn't clear, the hotel policy would freeze alcohol service for the entire event. I pictured the ripple effect irritated guests, murmurs, embarrassment. I wasn't going to let that happen, not yet. "Revert to Magnolia Override," I said. "Bill the balance to the venue tab." The manager hesitated. "You're sure completely?" I signed the slip. It wasn't generosity, it was strategy. The guests would never know, and neither would Charles. Not yet. The bar resumed. The music stayed smooth and the evening continued as if nothing had happened. But I noticed the way the manager looked at me afterward, curious, a hint of recognition flickering behind his eyes. He had seen my name before, not just on today's paperwork, but on the ownership line of the venue's operational license. I didn't confirm it. I just gave him a polite nod and turned back toward the dance floor. My mother caught my eye from across the room, smiling weakly as if asking, "Are we okay now?" I nodded once. The truth was complicated, but for tonight everything was under control. As the night deepened, laughter rose again, and the earlier awkwardness faded into memory. Guests twirled under the chandeliers, the band played its rehearsed set, and I walked quietly between tables checking water glasses and napkin folds. To anyone watching, I was just the event coordinator, another woman behind the scenes, making someone else's happiness possible. But I knew the truth. I was paying for peace one transaction at a time, waiting for the moment when the final receipt would fall into place. The sound of the POS terminal beeped again near the bar, faint but distinct. The manager looked at me and I nodded. He didn't need to say it aloud. The card had declined again. The thread had snapped. The moment unfolded like slow thunder. Dinner plates had been cleared, glasses refilled, and laughter swirled through the ballroom in polite waves. The chandeliers reflected soft gold on the polished floor. I was standing by the service counter reviewing post-event checklists when I noticed the manager walking toward me. His face had that expression of quiet urgency that every event coordinator knows. He leaned closer and spoke low. "Ms. Monroe, the payment issue with Mr. Grant's card is still unresolved." The terminal tried 3 times. Both Visa and Amex failed. I took a breath. "Did you attempt manual authorization?" "Yes, both over limit. The pre-authorization for the deposit is still holding, so the system is reading him as maxed out. And he doesn't know yet. Not yet." He looked uneasy. "Protocol requires we address it before closing the bar tab." I nodded. "Do it quietly." I stepped back, observing as the waiter approached Charles. The music softened a gentle piano piece that made the next few seconds feel cinematic in its cruelty. The waiter stood beside him, whispering, but the microphone near the DJ caught fragments of their exchange. "Sir, your card didn't go through." The guests closest to the head table turned. Charles frowned, glancing at the card. "Run it again." The waiter nodded and walked off, returning moments later with the same nervous expression. "I'm sorry, sir." It declined again. A silence spread like a tide. The bride froze mid-smile. Ethan's fork hovered in mid-air, and my mother's hand clutched her napkin as if it were an anchor. The waiter hesitated before speaking again. "Would you like to try another card?" Charles, visibly flustered, pulled out his Amex Platinum and handed it over with the arrogance of habit. "This one always works," he said. The waiter disappeared once more. The room had gone nearly silent now, the kind of quiet that precedes either a prayer or a disaster. I could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning. I could hear the clinking of a glass somewhere in the corner. and then the waiter returned. "Sir?" he said, voice low. This one also didn't go through. There it was, the soundless collapse of pride. Charles's jaw clenched. Impossible. There's no limit on that card. The waiter shifted uncomfortably. It's possible the pre-hold from the earlier reservation hasn't cleared yet. The system shows insufficient funds for the current balance. A murmur rippled across the tables. People exchanged glances. The bride whispered to the groom. My mother looked ready to faint. I saw it all unfold as if I were standing outside my body, detached, but aware of every detail. The band stopped mid-song. The air changed temperature. The manager approached calm but deliberate, holding a small receipt folder in his hands. "It's all right," he said. "The balance has been covered." Charles looked at him confused. Covered by who? The manager turned slightly, his tone still polite but firm. "Ms. Monroe settled it this morning." The silence that followed was deeper than before. Every head turned toward me, dozens of eyes each carrying its own story of curiosity, sympathy, or quiet judgment. I stood still, my expression neutral, the way you do when the truth has been waiting for its own introduction. "That can't be right," Charles said, voice strained. The manager held out the printout. The payment cleared at 9:30 a.m. today. Wire transfer from Magnolia Events. Reference line client default workaround. Section 5B. His words sliced through the air with the precision of a verdict. I had written that clause myself years ago after seeing too many events collapse under unpaid balances. It allowed an event manager to settle the account personally to preserve operations and reputation. It had never been used before, until today. My mother's lips trembled. "Lila," she whispered, "you didn't have to." "I did," I said gently. "It's for you, not him." The guests began to whisper. I caught phrases. "She paid it." Was that her company? "That's her stepfather, right?" The gossip swirled like wind through curtains. Aunt Marge, never one to miss her cue, leaned toward the table and muttered, "Just loud enough so $20 can buy silence." Interesting. I turned to her and smiled. "No," I said, my tone calm. "Policies do." A few guests chuckled nervously, unsure if it was safe to laugh. It was. The humor was gentle, but sharp enough to restore the balance of power. Charles stared at me, his face drained of color. "You embarrassed me," he whispered. "No," I said quietly, stepping closer. "You did that yourself. I just covered the bill." The manager placed the signed slip on the table, nodded respectfully, and retreated. The waiter followed, relief visible on his face. Around us, the noise slowly resumed, soft, clinking, low chatter, the hum of music returning as if nothing had happened, but everything had. My mother wiped her eyes. "You shouldn't have done that," she said again, voice trembling. "It wasn't your responsibility. It was my choice," I replied. Sometimes dignity comes with a price tag. Charles said nothing. His head was lowered, shoulders tight. He stared at the receipt as though it contained a confession he hadn't meant to sign. The guests began to rise, pretending to stretch, pretending not to watch. But they were watching. They would remember this. They would tell this story for years, the wedding where the stepdaughter in a $20 shirt paid off the debt of the man who mocked her. It was the kind of poetic justice that didn't need embellishment. I walked toward the bar where the manager stood waiting. "Thank you," I said, "for handling that with grace." He nodded. "It's rare to see policy used as protection instead of punishment." "That's what it's for," I said. "Boundaries are just polite versions of armor." I took the printout from his hand, folded it, and tucked it into my planner. The numbers were neat, exact $23,600, paid in full. The last entry on that balance sheet wasn't just money, it was silence purchased cleanly. When I returned to the table, the atmosphere had shifted. My mother looked at me with something between sorrow and pride. Aunt Marge avoided my eyes. Ethan and Anna whispered softly, their faces pale with awkward sympathy. Charles sat frozen, his hand still on the useless Amex card. I could almost feel his thoughts unraveling, trying to reconcile how the girl he dismissed as a burden had become the woman who now held the financial upper hand. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then the band started playing again, slow and cautious, as if testing the air. People resumed eating. The hum returned. Life went on because it always does. But the hierarchy had changed, quietly, irrevocably. When the night finally ended and the guests drifted out under the river breeze, I stayed behind. The chandeliers dimmed, the candles melted into small pools of wax, and the floor gleamed with the faint reflection of the past 12 hours. I walked to the center of the room and looked at the empty head table where everything had begun. On the linen sat the folded receipt left behind by accident or intention, I couldn't tell. I unfolded it once more, glanced at the total, then placed it back where it was. Some debts didn't need collecting. The room was silent except for the faint sound of water against the glass outside. It was a good silence, the kind you earn after years of keeping your balance, while others try to unmake it. Karma. I thought doesn't always knock. Sometimes it just sends an invoice. The morning after the wedding, Charleston felt heavier than usual. The air still carried traces of champagne and river salt, the city waking up slow, unaware that one family's reputation had cracked overnight. By 8 a.m., my phone was already buzzing. First came a text from my cousin girl, "Your name is all over Facebook," then another from a college friend. "You didn't tell me you were the drama." I opened my notifications and saw its screenshots, comments, speculation. In the private family group my mother's side used for reunions, someone had posted a photo from the reception with the caption, "She embarrassed her stepdad in front of everyone." The post had 50 comments already. The usual suspects' cousins who never called but always had opinions chimed in. Disrespectful, so ungrateful. Money doesn't buy class. I scrolled silently, my coffee going cold. The toxic family chorus had arrived right on schedule. What none of them knew, of course, was that I had saved that night from total humiliation. Without my transfer, the venue would have frozen the bar, the guests would have gone dry, and the entire wedding would have collapsed. But truth rarely trends online. False virtue does. By noon, my mother called. "They're saying horrible things," she said, her voice shaky. "Charles is furious. He said you made him look like a fool." "He did that himself," I said. "I just didn't stop him. Please don't post anything," she whispered, as if defending him was a reflex she couldn't shake. "I'm not posting anything," I said. "I don't need to." After hanging up, I opened my laptop and drafted a new email. Not to argue, not to explain, just to document. It was time for my own version of narrative control. The subject line read, "Thank you for attending Magnolia events." The body was warm, polite, and surgical. I thanked every guest for attending Ethan and Anna's wedding and included a small digital voucher 10% off any future family event booking at Magnolia Events. It was a thoughtful gesture, the kind that made people feel appreciated. And under the list of eligible surnames, I left one conspicuously missing, Grant. The system required a reason field for exclusions, so I typed it cleanly. Outstanding balance history. The email went out to 93 recipients at 3:00 p.m. Within an hour, my inbox lit up with thank yous and heart emojis. A few guests even forwarded the message to friends, calling it the classiest follow-up they had ever received. And then came the explosion. My stepfather's side of the family started messaging Marion, directly accusing Magnolia Events of discrimination. She called me, laughing so hard she could barely speak. "You really did it," she said between breaths. "You excluded the Grants only for policy reasons," I said, sipping my tea. "We have to protect our brand integrity." "Oh, honey," she said, still laughing, "that's not revenge. That's art." The following day, Charles's nephew posted another rant calling me unprofessional. I didn't respond, but my legal department did. A concise statement went out to him explaining that Magnolia Events enforces standardized policies for all clients with overdue accounts, regardless of relation. It included an itemized payment summary signed by Charles himself. It shut the thread down within minutes. I kept receipts for everything. That was my armor. Meanwhile, Ethan reached out privately. "I just wanted to say thank you," he texted. "You didn't deserve what happened. I know Dad was out of line." I stared at the message for a long time before replying, "Thank you, Ethan. Take care of your wife." He sent a thumbs-up emoji and never texted again. That was fine. Closure didn't need conversation. 2 weeks later, I received a call from the accounting department at the hotel. "We still have an unpaid service fee tied to the grant account," the manager said. "Should we escalate? Send it to me," I said. The outstanding amount was small $875, but the principal mattered. I drafted a repayment agreement with monthly installments, each page signed electronically by Charles Grant. It wasn't about the money. It was about accountability, written, time-stamped, permanent. By signing, he acknowledged every unpaid cent. I filed it under family accounts and set automated reminders to trigger each due date. The story financial arc was complete. My revenge wasn't loud, it was structured. A week later, another ripple hit social media. One of the guests posted a long, glowing review of Magnolia Events, praising the professionalism and grace under pressure of its director, Lila Monroe. Within a day, the post gained traction. New inquiries poured in 3 bookings in one weekend, all from clients who had attended the wedding. Marion called again. "You turned their gossip into marketing." "No," I said, smiling. "They did that for me." "How's your mother?" she asked. "Still in the middle, I guess." Trying to calm both sides. "And you." "Calm isn't my goal. Clarity is." She paused. "You always did have a strange gift for quiet justice." I liked the phrase. Quiet justice. It fit. That weekend, I took a walk by the Ashley River, the same one that bordered the ballroom. The water looked different now, less like reflection, more like evidence. The wind was warm, the air smelling faintly of salt and jasmine. I thought about the noise of that night, the way the room had gasped when they heard my name, and how afterward the silence had felt clean. Justice, when done properly, isn't about ruin. It's about restoring symmetry. Over the next few months, the Grant family retreated from public life. Charles stopped showing up at trade shows, his business losing small contracts, as whispers about his wedding meltdown spread quietly through Charleston's social circles. Reputation, I learned, decays faster than credit. The irony was that no one could trace the story directly to me. I hadn't posted a word. I hadn't corrected anyone. I had simply followed policy. The consequences unfolded naturally like math. By the end of the quarter, Magnolia Events had tripled its engagement metrics. Our newsletter subscribers had doubled. When Marion showed me the numbers, she smiled. "Karma pays dividends," she said. "You might want to trademark that." "No," I said. "I like letting it circulate for free." The repayment from Charles continued on schedule for 3 months before stopping abruptly. The system flagged the default automatically. I didn't chase it. Instead, I forwarded the file to our collections partner with the note, "Per policy." Nothing more needed to be said. By Christmas, the story had already fossilized into Charleston lore, the girl who built her empire out of composure and contracts. At a dinner that December, one of my clients leaned across the table at the end whispered, "You were at that wedding, weren't you?" I smiled faintly. "Which one?" "The one where the stepfather's card declined." "Ah," I said. "That one." She grinned. "Legendary." I raised my glass. To professionalism. We clinked glasses, and for the first time that year, I allowed myself to laugh without restraint. Revenge doesn't always roar. Sometimes it signs in triplicate and sends thank you notes. 3 months after the wedding, Charleston had already moved on, but the cracks in the Grant home empire had started to widen. The local business section of the Post and Courier ran a short piece titled "Grant Home Interiors Faces Delayed Expansion Amid Market Strain." It was a polite way of saying the company was drowning in unpaid invoices and declining sales. I read it over breakfast, stirring cream into my coffee without emotion. Karma had its own calendar. A week later, my assistant told me someone had requested an appointment through the Magnolia Events contact form. When she said the name, I almost laughed. "Charles Grant," she said. "He wants to discuss a corporate partnership." "Approve it," I said. "Let him come in." He arrived 2 days later in a suit that looked slightly too big, the kind of fit that comes when someone loses weight they didn't plan to lose. His handshake was tentative, his eyes darting around the office lined with framed photos of past events, galas, fundraisers, awards. His logo had never been among them. "You've done well," he said stiffly. "Magnolia seems to be everywhere now." "Hard work travels fast," I said, motioning for him to sit. He glanced at the awards on the wall again before clearing his throat. "I'm organizing a grand opening for our new store on King Street. We could use someone with your experience. It would help both our brands. I'm sure we can find a mutually beneficial arrangement." His tone carried that old habit of command, as if the past humiliation had been a rumor instead of a reckoning. "Of course," I said, pretending to take notes. "What's your budget?" He hesitated. "I was hoping we could discuss some flexibility. A professional courtesy discount, maybe 10 or 15%. We've had a rough quarter." I folded my hands. "Charles Magnolia Events doesn't offer discounts. Our rates are standardized and public. But this is different," he said quickly. "It's family." I met his gaze. So was that wedding. The silence between us was sharp enough to cut glass. He shifted uncomfortably. "Look, I'm trying to rebuild. This event is crucial. The bank is watching, investors are nervous. I just need this launch to go smoothly. Send me your details," I said. "I'll prepare a proposal." After he left, I sat for a long time, staring at the empty chair across from my desk. The irony was so heavy, it was almost beautiful. The same man who once mocked my $20 shirt now needed my signature to keep his business alive. I opened a new document and began typing the proposal. Event coordination fee, $58,000. Venue management fee, 30% deposit balance due 5 business days before the event. Payment condition, full prepayment required before activation. Clause 7 newly added read as follows: Magnolia Events shall not display or co-brand any logo or marketing material adjacent to or overlapping with the client's mark, Grant Home Interiors, in any printed, digital, or physical medium. I signed the bottom and sent it to his inbox. Within an hour, he replied, "Surely you can remove that clause. It makes it look like we're being excluded." I typed back, "It's standard brand protection. You understand reputation management, I'm sure." He waited a day before responding. "You're punishing me," I answered with one line. "No, I'm protecting my team." 2 days passed before he called. His voice was strained, the confidence stripped away. "Leela, I can't prepay. The loan didn't clear yet. Can we start planning while the funds process? You know I'm good for it. The contract requires payment before services begin," I said calmly. "Exceptions create precedent. I don't make those. You'd really turn down business in this economy. Quality over quantity," I said. "Always." The call ended with a long silence on his end, followed by a quiet click. A week later, I drove past the new Grant Home storefront. The windows were still papered over the lights off. The banner that once read, "Grand Opening April 12th" had been replaced with a smaller, less confident sign, "Opening Soon." 2 weeks later, that sign was gone too. My assistant later confirmed what I already suspected: one of the 3 stores had closed permanently, citing market restructuring. It wasn't malice that made me feel satisfied. It was justice in its purest administrative form. Every choice had a receipt. A month after that, my mother showed up unannounced at the office carrying a grocery bag of homemade cookies. "He told me what happened," she said softly. "He thinks you hate him." "I don't," I said. "I just stopped protecting him. He says you embarrassed him again." "He embarrassed himself again?" She sighed and placed the cookies on my desk. "You get that from me, you know." The stubbornness. Maybe I said, smiling faintly, "But the paperwork." "That's all Charles." She laughed despite herself shaking her head. "You're colder than you used to be." "No," I said, "just clearer." After she left, I stood by the window watching the street. Outside, a delivery truck passed by with a faded Grant Home decal barely visible under the sun. It struck me how quickly empires fade when they're built on borrowed respect. That evening, I received a message from an unknown number. It was short, "The store's gone." I tried. For a moment, I considered replying. Maybe something neutral, something like, "I hope you find peace." But then I remembered his laughter that night in the ballroom, the way his words cut through me in front of strangers. I closed the message without responding. Some silence is the only reply that keeps its dignity. 2 weeks later, Marion and I met at a rooftop restaurant overlooking the water. She poured us both glasses of chilled white wine. "I heard about Grant Home," she said. "Closure, liquidation, all that. You had nothing to do with it, right?" Her smile told me she already knew the answer. "Not directly," I said, "but I did decline a proposal." "Good," she said. "Some lessons need invoices, not lectures." We toasted to that. The sun slipped beneath the horizon, turning the river copper and gold. I thought about Charles again, the way he used to say, "Budget is love." For him, love was leverage. For me, it had become boundaries. As I watched the light fade, I realized something simple but profound. I didn't need his apology anymore. His loss was already saying it for him. A month later, I received an industry email about upcoming vendor showcases. Magnolia Events was listed under featured premier hosts. Grant Home Interiors wasn't listed at all. I read the email twice, then archived it. No satisfaction, no malice, just closure. Sometimes revenge doesn't look like triumph. It looks like peace that cannot be purchased. The quiet after everything fell apart felt strange. The headlines about Grant Home's collapse had faded, and Charleston returned to its usual rhythm of church bells, salt air, and weekend markets. Magnolia Events was busier than ever yet. Inside me, there was a stillness that felt like both victory and exhaustion. One afternoon in late March, the office smelled like jasmine candles and printer ink when the front desk buzzed. "Ms. Monroe, my assistant, said your mother's here." I looked up from the financial reports on my screen. My mother, she brought something, the assistant said, lowering her voice as if it were classified information. "It smells like sugar." Moments later, Diana appeared in the doorway holding a glass baking dish wrapped in a floral towel. Peach cobbler, her peace offering since forever. She smiled tentatively, her eyes soft with the weight of apology. "I figured you could use something sweet," she said, "or at least something warm. You didn't have to bring that." I said, standing. "I did," she said quickly. "I've been meaning to see you. I just didn't know how to start." We sat at the small round table by the window. The afternoon light cut through the blinds, making soft stripes across the room. She placed the cobbler between us, the scent of butter and cinnamon filling the air. "You've been doing well," she said, glancing at the awards on the wall. "I saw the article about Magnolia. You've built something real." "It took time," I said, "and distance." She nodded, guilt flickering in her eyes. "I should have stood up for you sooner. I kept telling myself silence kept the peace, but I think I confused peace with fear." "You did what you thought would keep the family together," I said quietly, "but it cost us both something." She sighed. "He's not the man I married anymore. Losing the store, the respect it changed him. He's quieter now. Maybe humbled. Maybe just tired. That's his journey," I said. "Mine's different." She hesitated, then smiled faintly. "You sound like your father when you talk like that, always sure of your own compass." "That's a good thing," I said, trying to make it gentle. She reached for a fork and scooped a piece of cobbler into a small paper plate. "You'll like this one." I added a little brown sugar this time. I took a bite, the flavor pulling memories from years ago Sundays when things were simpler before money became a weapon. "It's good," I said. "I might have to invoice you for emotional labor, though." She laughed, startled by the humor. "You would." "I bill in slices," I said, smiling. She laughed again, the kind that comes from relief rather than amusement. For a few minutes we sat there eating quiet but comfortable. Then she said softly, "I saw the announcement online. The Grace Gala. Is that yours?" "Yes," I said. "It's something new. A scholarship fund, $25,000 a year to support women starting small businesses. We're partnering with the community college and 2 local banks. First event is next spring." "Grace," she repeated. "That's a beautiful name. It's not just a word," I said. "It's an ideal, the kind that survives pride and noise. You always were good at finding meaning in things." She said, her tone proud but tinged with regret. "Where did you learn that?" "From watching you survive quietly," I said. "You called it compromise. I call it patience." She smiled through tears. "I'm proud of you, Lila. You don't have to say that," I said softly. "I know. I want to," she insisted. "You carried so much on your own. I kept hoping things would fix themselves. They never did. You fixed them." "I just made sure the math added up," I said. "Justice is mostly accounting." She reached across the table, touching my hand. "And forgiveness?" I looked out the window, watching a couple walk by holding hands. "Forgiveness is interest," I said. "It grows slowly, and sometimes you don't realize it's there until you stop checking the balance." She nodded, understanding, without needing more words. When she left an hour later, she hugged me for the first time in years. It wasn't dramatic, just long enough to mean something real. That night, after everyone had gone home, I walked through the empty ballroom of the new Magnolia headquarters. We had just finished renovations. The chandeliers glowed above the polished oak floors, and for a moment I imagined the Grace Gala here. The tables dressed in ivory linen, the stage set with soft lighting, women from all over Charleston, gathered to celebrate courage that didn't need permission. I pictured the scholarship recipients giving their speeches, voices steady, hands shaking slightly just like mine once did. I wanted it to be a space where dignity didn't need defending, only nurturing. The next morning, I drafted the announcement post. The Grace Gala Empowering Women to Build, Lead, and Begin Again. The subheading read, "Because grace is not weakness. It is quiet strength that stands." The response was overwhelming. Dozens of messages from local entrepreneurs, teachers, and even former clients filled my inbox. People wanted to donate to volunteer to attend. Marion called within an hour. "It's spreading like wildfire," she said. "Everyone wants in." "Good," I said. "Let's make it annual. You know," she said, "you're not just coordinating events anymore. You're rewriting what they mean." "Maybe," I said. "Or maybe I'm just making room for better stories." She paused. "Same thing." That evening, my mother texted a photo. She was holding a plate of leftover cobbler and smiling at the camera. The caption said, "I'll bring more next week. No invoice." I stared at it for a long time before replying with a single word, "Deal." For the first time in years, it didn't feel like we were balancing accounts. We were just starting over, both of us lighter for it. Standing by the window of my office, I watched the city lights shimmer across the river. The world outside was loud and busy, but inside everything was calm. Dignity had replaced validation, quiet justice had replaced noise, and Grace had finally taken root. 1 year later, on a warm June evening in 2025, the Gibby's Museum of Art glowed with soft amber light. The first annual Grace Gala had sold out weeks in advance. Marble floors shimmered under crystal chandeliers, and the faint scent of gardenias filled the air. It felt surreal to see my name printed on the program cover, embossed in gold letters, Grace Gala, presented by Magnolia Events Director Lila Monroe. The night had been months of preparation, but tonight it belonged to something larger than work. It belonged to the idea that respect and renewal could coexist. Guests arrived in elegant gowns and tailored suits, the hum of conversation echoing through the museum's atrium. Journalists hovered by the press table taking notes on the stories of the scholarship recipients, 6 women who had each started businesses, from kitchen tables, garages, or borrowed laptops. I watched them laugh together, confident, radiant, unaware that a year ago they were where I once stood, unseen but unbroken. When the orchestra paused for the main speech, the master of ceremonies stepped onto the stage. His voice was calm and measured. Tonight, we honor resilience, grace, and those who turn adversity into architecture. Please join me in welcoming the woman who made this possible, Director of Magnolia Events, Ms. Lila Monroe. The applause came like a wave. As I stood, the sound grew louder, rolling through the hall until it became something physical, something I could feel in my chest. For a heartbeat, I couldn't move. Then I walked to the stage, the lights warm on my face. I spoke about beginnings that looked like endings, about how quiet strength is the foundation no one can take. I thanked the donors, the recipients, and the community that believed in rebuilding dignity through opportunity. When I finished, the room rose to its feet again. From the stage, the sea of faces blurred into one shining mosaic, except for one figure in the back row, Charles. He sat alone, his posture straight but heavy. His hair had grayed more than I remembered, and his hands were clasped tightly in his lap. For a second, I thought he might look away, but when the audience stood, he rose too. No words, no gestures, just a man standing in the back of a room full of witnesses. It wasn't an apology, but it was acknowledgement. Sometimes that's enough. After the ceremony, I walked out to the museum balcony overlooking the Ashley River. The night air was cool, brushing against the silk of my dress. The city shimmered beyond the water. Restaurants, closing boats anchored in silence, the hum of Charleston breathing in and out. Behind me, the laughter of guests drifted from the ballroom, mingling with the faint notes of the band's closing song. Marion joined me, holding 2 glasses of champagne. To 1 year of grace, she said, handing me one. To boundaries that turned into bridges, I replied, clinking glasses. "You think he'll ever say it?" she asked quietly. "Sorry, I mean." I looked out over the river. Maybe. But I don't need him to. She smiled knowingly. That's the part he'll never understand. We stood there in silence for a while, watching the reflection of the museum lights ripple across the water. Somewhere inside, my mother was talking with guests, telling them how proud she was. I caught a glimpse of her through the glass, laughing, gesturing animatedly at peace, in a way she hadn't been for years. That image alone was worth every late night, every contract, every moment of restraint. Later, after the guests had gone and the last of the crew was packing up, I took one final walk through the ballroom. The tables were half cleared, the candles flickering down to stubs. On one chair near the back, I saw a folded program. Inside, in careful handwriting, someone had written, "Thank you for reminding me that character outlives money." It wasn't signed, but I didn't need a signature. Outside, the air had cooled, and the sound of the river lapped softly against the dock below. I leaned on the railing, letting the wind lift the loose strands of my hair. The city stretched before me, quiet and infinite. In that stillness, I realized the real ending wasn't revenge or even redemption, it was release. Somewhere behind me, Charles's world had crumbled. Grant Home had sold 2 of its remaining stores to pay off debts, leaving only 1 location still standing. The report said he planned to retire. I didn't feel triumph, only inevitability. Money may move fast, but integrity endures longer. I thought of something my mentor Marion once told me. Karma isn't punishment. It's proof. Tonight, proof filled the air like music. The scholarships, the applause, the quiet smiles, it all existed because I chose not to spend my dignity for temporary peace. Standing there, I whispered the words I wished someone had told me years ago. Respect isn't currency. It's credit you build and never spend cheap. The wind carried it over the river, disappearing into the dark. I smiled, then not the smile of victory, but of arrival. Tomorrow the work would begin again, emails, budgets, meetings, but tonight I allowed myself stillness. Quiet justice had done its work. Grace had turned into legacy.